when London got the bid in 2007, I began to think about how the work I'd been doing over the previous 20 years could inform an understanding of what the impact and meaning of the games was and was going to be for different communities in East London. And so what I did then was I set up some focus groups which actually met about every 12 months actually, from 2007 to 2012. There was a youth group and there was an adult group. The youth group changed, the membership changed over the time, although there were a few, 4 or 5 who actually stayed with it. So what I was interested in was actually how the vicissitudes of the Olympic delivery, how that impacted on people's sort of perceptions and the sort of sense of stake or not they had in the whole Olympic project. So that's what I kind of tracked through. When I came to write the book, what I did was the first third of the book, it's not about the Olympics at all. It brings together all the kind of ethnographic research that I've been doing over the previous 20 years into the impact of demographic and structural change on people's lives, life stories, livelihoods, and so on. So that kind of sets the stage for the second half of the book, which consists of a series of essays, really, of different aspects of the kind of Olympic project. And it sort of combines different approaches. So some of it is ethnographic. Some of it is there's one chapter which is a very, very detailed reading of the Olympic ceremonies and the kind of story of the nation that they kind of construct, and some of the tensions and contradictions, and how Danny Ball trying to sort of weave together a kind of seamless narrative of the kind of progressive aspects of that story. But because of the kind of constraints of the medium, of the sort of spectacular form of the ceremony, had to sort of fudge a number of kind of key issues, really. So that would be, I suppose, a more kind of media studies approach to understanding the Olympics as spectacle, right? There's a chapter about which is based on the ethnographic work I did on the actual Olympic site, where I interviewed the construction workers and particularly the tunnellers. But that actually became a chapter about about masculinity, manual labour, and athleticism, because it seemed to me that it's called In the Zone. Because it seemed to me a lot of the body politics around the Olympics. I mean, there are particular moments where they become highly racialized, but they do actually play upon an issue which is not often addressed as to why sport is such an important aspect of working class culture. And clearly in East London, it's been an avenue of aspiration and achievement for a whole series of immigrant communities, the Jewish community, for example, in boxing, all those Jewish boxing champions, and increasingly for the black East Londoners. I mean, sport is a way of. It's a way of. I mean, I was particularly interested in its relation to masculinity. If you've got a situation where the culture of manual labour is being sidelined, marginalised, demographically shrunk. Yet in the kind of culture of athleticism, that kind of masculine body gets revalorised, or even hypervalorised. So I was interested in that sort of dialectic, if you like, between the fact that people were no longer working with their bodies in the way that the dockers had, or the other people, EastEnders, but they were playing with their bodies, and body as a medium of sport. That became a very important sort of avenue. So, and then how does that link to the actual manual labours performed on the Olympic construction sites? These tunnellers, obviously are highly skilled, but nevertheless, even with their new technologies and their laser technologies, it's still a very heavy manual labour job. And there was a moment in the portrayal of the construction process. I was quite interested in how the whole construction process was portrayed, in which the heroic Promethean aspects of manual labour were resurrected. because the whole aspect of it was there was this extraordinary site. It was presented as being highly polluted. Its history, its industrial labour history, was erased because that was a bad news. So what got erased along with that was the lives of the hundreds of thousands of people in East London whose livelihoods were bound up with those jobs. And they might have been the jobs, the industries might have been pollutants, but they nevertheless were a source of livelihood for people. And I was very concerned that some aspect of that history of manual labour and its relationship to masculinity was accepted in sport and in the context of sport, but was regarded as bad news, something to be cleansed, if you like, when it came to representing the history of this area. So I wanted a book that actually told that story from the point of view of East Londoners themselves, not the sort of top-down, sort of triumphalist narrative of London wins the games. So that was the main thrust of the book, really, was to provide this alternative perspective on what the games meant from the vantage point of East Londoners themselves. I think the Convergence agenda was put together as a means of creating a relatively progressive agenda for the Olympics. I mean that the Olympics is a utopian project in one sense, in a number of senses, but not least in the kind of ramped up legacy promises that are created around it. All those images of people jumping over Tower Bridge, and it was about, we were in this period of austerity. What the government thought it would be about raising aspirations, inspiring a generation. Was remember all those banners saying "Inspire a Generation"? It was to lift people out of these dog days, out of the cuts in public services, against the kind of new austerity regimes and so on. This was to be a moment in which the nation came together, in which East London represented not poverty, not deprivation, not austerity, but this vibrant, multicultural, entrepreneurial kind of world. And that's what East London was exploited to present, I think. Now, the issue then became having ramped up the expectations to an unrealistic level. I mean, I keep on saying, we want a good enough Olympics. We want realistic goals, things that can actually be delivered. But the Convergence agenda, although it appears to have these kind of performance, these indicators of how we can measure how much has been delivered, and so that life chances of people being born and growing up here in East London will be the same as those living in Kensington, in the more affluent parts of London and so on. Well, I think there's two things about that. So rhetorically, it's about legitimating this aspirational agenda in a period of hard times when inequalities are intensifying, right? So the actual gaps in whether it's income or housing or living conditions or education and so on, those inequalities are intensifying. Now, if you have an agenda that then says, well, the Olympics can somehow either suspend or reverse those processes, right? Simply by injecting investments, or by injecting, just take sport and obesity, for example, okay, if they're indicators. Okay, so we can have lots of sports participation projects. We can hope the Olympics will kind of ramp up young people's involvement. Well, it didn't happen, as we know. Obesity rates are now higher in East London than they were before 2007, actually. So I think its real function is rhetorical. That's my main point, okay? Is to create a apparently plausible platform of aspiration that people in East London can identify with and say, oh yes, we'd like that. Of course we'd like our children to have the same life chances as children who live in Hampstead. Of course, who wouldn't? Or as Boris Johnson put it, they can learn how to play rugby. How excellent. If they can play rugby, great. It'll be, I mean, that's the sort of banality that actually underlies the rhetoric. At the same time, it seems to me that what it also does methodologically is try and generate some quantitative indicators of what are actually really rather qualitative processes. I mean, if you think about, because a lot of it is about perception. It's not about the actual material influence. It's not about creating ladders of opportunity. It should be about creating ladders of opportunity so that the existing skills base of East London is, over a period of time, transformed so that it can engage in a geared up way with the knowledge economy, with the new economy, if you like, right? Well, the amount of investment that would be required to deliver the actual indices of convergence for that is enormous. I mean, beyond, especially in our present economic circumstances, it's simply not on the cards.
Why is that?
Why is it? Because, well, first of all, you can't draw a line around East London and say, in East London, we can inject so much infrastructure development, so much education, so much good housing, whatever. Never mind what's happening in the rest of London, never mind what's happening in the rest of the country, never mind actually the economy, the actual impact. We're in a low wage, low investment, low growth, low productivity economy. Suddenly, East London is going to be an exception to all that. So it's an exceptionalist agenda. Now, there's only one example of what actually happens when you try and create an exceptional circumstance against the grain of the dominant kind of economic situation. You take East Village. The interesting thing about East Village, one of the things that's distinctive about it and exceptional about it, is the fact that it has enhanced policing. Right? If you look at a crime map of East London and you see East 20 is almost blank. There's almost no crime. Okay, so in East Village, the LLDC and Get Living London, which is the kind of property arm of Qatari DR, have paid for additional policing. So that means there are 3 times more police on the street in East Village than in any other place in London, certainly in East London. Right? And this is we interviewed one of the senior policemen involved in this. Of course, they've also got their own security staff on top of that. Plus, you have the 24/7 maintenance staff. So it's one of the most controlled, surveyed spaces, probably in the whole of London. Well, under those circumstances, I mean, you might expect there not to be much crime. Now, you could say, does that mean, therefore, it's once you plug in that amount of additional resource, you can create a safe space? Okay, it's true, it happens. There are other factors as well in play that actually would tend to reduce crime anyway, but I'll leave those aside for one moment. Now, let's imagine that we took the same model of enhanced resource and applied that to housing. I mean, this is something you know more about than I do, probably. But let's imagine that, therefore, we decided that in East 20, this new piece of London, this new postal code which they've created, we are going to actually have so much really affordable social housing, that is, housing that's defined as a proportion of people's incomes, not as a relationship to the market rent. That's a true definition of affordable housing. We are therefore going to create 50% of genuinely affordable housing in all the neighbourhoods in East London. Now, if you were to apply that to the plan that the London Legacy Development Corporation have for recouping the vast, the amount of money, the public money that's already been spent on that, they would go bust. They don't have the resources to do it. They have the resources to pay for some extra cops, extra police around. They don't have the resources to deliver that kind of level of social housing and the kind of infrastructure support that would be required. They just don't have the resources. So that's why I say the main function of the convergent agenda is rhetorical.
You've been doing some research on the park in East Village. It'd be helpful to tell us something about that research, how it came about, and what your key findings are.
Right. Okay. So what we wanted to do was, in a way, was a kind of follow up to the book. The book stops at actually it came out in early 2013. But essentially, it stops at 2012. So I wanted to do a kind of follow-up study. Now, obviously, in terms of legacy, I mean, East Village is the first instance, really, of the sort of housing legacy being delivered, or indeed a more general kind of sense of a material legacy being delivered. So a lot's riding on it, and there is a narrative that's been attached to it, which is just as the Olympics. The ideal of the Olympics, the utopian ideal of the Olympics, is to bring people together from different backgrounds, different cultures, different nations in peaceful coexistence. And of course, that's something I really supported. That aspect of it. So East Village was to continue that Olympic dream. It was to bring together people from different backgrounds, different income levels, social tenants, intermediate tenants, shared ownership and private tenants together in harmony. So it was a very strong legacy narrative which was used to promote East Village as an experiment in multi-tenure housing and bringing these different kinds of people together from different walks of life, from different cultures and communities, and they're all to live together peaceably. Well, what we discussed, so we wanted to document that, and we wanted also to really find out what the people who are moving in, what sense they were making of that, how they responded to that, if you like, grand narrative. Did they buy into it? Did they accept that? Did they see themselves almost as pioneers, or carrying on the Olympic torch in moving in there? Or did they have much more kind of immediate, practical, mundane sort of concerns and interests, and they really weren't that bothered about it being an ex-Olympic thing at all? So the way we went about it was we did 4 different things. We interviewed a sample of the tenants. A colleague of mine, Debbie Humphries, I think you've already spoken to, did a photography project with some adults there, where they made a kind of collective portrait of their sense of the place. I did a project with young people. About teenagers. We made a video with them about their sense of the place, their views of the Olympics, where they went, where they hung out, what they liked, what they didn't like, and so on. And then we did a project with Chobham Academy, which was one of the Olympic legacy deliverables. It's an academy school on the edge of East Village. And we worked with them to produce their own map and guide to Olympic Park. That was funded by the London Legacy Development Corporation, which I'll come back to. Now, it wasn't the case that we simply regarded the research as the field work, in other words, the interviews and then hangout. I spent a lot of time just sitting around in East Village, sitting on the benches, seeing who was walking around. I did a little study of the chewing gum trails. There was no chewing gum on the pavements. There was no graffiti. I mean, it was an incredibly sanitized environment. It's partly because of the 24/7 maintenance. If anyone did a graffiti, it would immediately get wiped off. So it was this very kind of sanitized environment. Anyway, so we did the ethnography, we did the interviews, but we also used the photography and the video as a research environment. So, in actually, putting together the video, I mean, we learnt an awful lot from the young people. They went on walkabouts, basically. So we did these kind of video walkabouts. And I've always found that a useful device because as people walk, they remember stuff. Oh, we went there, we met there. Oh, we wouldn't go down there because of, So you get a sense of their sort of mental maps, really, of the area. And one of the interesting things we came up with, I don't know if Debbie mentioned this, was this notion of the dark side. The Olympic Park, we were interested in 2 things. How did people typify different aspects of their environment? So it was interesting the way particular blocks got typified as triathlon, that is, social tenants, intermediate and whatever, or Get Living London. And for the first couple of months, that's what happened. There was an intense process of social typification. Even though it was a sort of pepper potting, so around the courtyard, you would have, it was on 4 sides, it was enclosed. You would have one block that was predominantly private tenants, one block that was predominantly triathlon, and that's what people did. They made a sort of mental note, that's triathlon, that's Get Living London. So really, for me, pepper potting would be, you'd really mix them up so they shared the same staircase, the same lifts, the same lobbies. That didn't happen. So there was an initial distinction between the private tenants and the rest. The second thing that happened was that the common space, because these blocks are built around a very large courtyard, and this was, of course, where the Olympic ideal of commingling was to take place. People were to come out of their houses, of their kind of separate blocks, and mix and meet and get to know each other, and and so on and so forth. What actually happened was that because the ground floor apartments were townhouses on 2 floors, and they were let either to groups of young single professionals if they were private, or to people with large families if they were social. Now, the people with quite 3 or 4 children, whatever, their backyards opened out onto the commons. So quite obviously, the children would, playing in the backyards, would go out into the common area, and in a sense colonised it, and use it as an outdoor adventure playground. So they'd be racketing around the sites, playing games, whatever, and of course making noise. Okay, so now in a council estate, very few council estates are enclosed on 4 sides. They're sometimes on 3 sides. And it's important to know that they were enclosed on 4 sides. But it's anyway generally part of that kind of culture that children do play out. People could keep an eye on their children from the balconies. There are often older teenagers around. It's quite a police space actually, right? Well now, in the East Village context, it's a common area. It's not public because no one from outside can walk in. It's not private, so it is actually a common space between the public and the private. In that sense, it's safe space because children can't get out and strangers can't walk in. But what happened was that the children took it over. The adults didn't use it hardly at all. The noise amplified because it was surrounded on 4 sides. The noise got greater the higher up you were. So there was a noise problem. And the noise problem, what was initially kind of like noise amplification, became deviancy amplification, because then what happened was that the private tenants said, look at these social tenants, they can't control their children, they're bad parents, the children are making a mess, there's litter everywhere. There were all sorts of stories we started to collect indicating that the social tenants were being regarded as, well, actually as rubbish. I mean, they shouldn't have been there. And there was often people say to us, we were expecting, because the place was being promoted as, trendy, cosmopolitan, urban buzz, whatever. I said, but it's like living in a council estate. So there was that reaction. There are very strict regulations applying to East Village. For example, in terms of what you can have on the balcony. In fact, what you can't have your washing. You can't put a bicycle there. You can put a chair there. And you can't smoke in the balconies. There's not much you can do in the balconies, right? I don't know about having sex, but anyway, you could. But the balconies. You walk around the place. There's nothing in the balconies. You go to some other cities. People are hanging washing across the balconies. It's actually quite. It's rather interesting what people hang outside, isn't it? It gives you a sense of. The relationship between the inside and the outside becomes permeable, and those balconies, they're like in the theatre in a way. You could sit in the balcony, and there you're a spectator of the street view below. So in some forms of urbanism, the balcony plays a very important communal role. People are talking across it. People are hanging their washing out. People are shouting up to it. Now none of that was to apply to this new piece of city. What they wanted was something that apparently had the sense of urban buzz, but not, if you like, the messy bits of urban buzz. And this comes back to this notion of the dark side. The dark side was described to us by some of the tenants in East Village as referring to Stratford, old Stratford. And he took the image of the dark side from the park itself, because the park, as you know, is divided into two. The South Park, which is more urban, where the main venues are, and the North Park, which is more rural and meadows and so forth. Now, at night, the North Park is dark, mainly because for the wildlife there. There is some lighting, obviously. And, of course, you're talking about a park that's open 24/7. And, of course, highly surveyed with CCTV cameras and so on, so it's a very securitized space as well. But the North Park is dark, and the South Park is brilliantly lit. So that distinction between the dark and the light actually, became an important part of people's sort of, if you like, psychogeographies, this distinction between the dark and the light. Now, when it came to contrasting East Village with Stratford, East Village was clean. As I've explained, it's got this 24/7 maintenance, there's no graffiti, there's no sort of the messiness of kind of the many kinds of urban life. Well, in Stratford, you've got the street market, it's noisy, you've got piles of stuff up there, and so they saw that as messy. So that distinction between a clean, sanitized, safe environment and a messy, buzzy, but possibly risky environment became quite established in people's kind of psychogeographies. And of course it has all sorts of class connotations and indeed race connotations as well, which people were aware, so they would kind of introduce the term in a slightly shamefaced way. Oh, that's the dark side. Or ye olde Stratford was the other way they described it. So this distinction between the old East End and the new East End, between, if you like, the new economy and the old economy, was actually being graphically reproduced in people's accounts of their intimate relations with their neighbours.
Could you talk about the demographic of people living in East Village in terms of the social and the GLL?
Yeah, yes. Obviously, we only interviewed a small sample. I think we interviewed 46 people altogether. And actually, we did ask both GLL and Triathlon for information about people's socioeconomic background and stuff. And they do have that information, but they wouldn't release it to us. So the straight answer is I don't have a demographic profile of East Village residents. But what I can say more impressionistically is that, what has happened in the last 6 months is that the demographic has changed in ethnic terms, that there's quite a large number of Chinese people have kind of moved into East Village, into the private rental sector. The private rental sector was very slow. You see, that was the other imbalance. At the beginning, the social housing was very quickly taken up. Intermediate and shared ownership also, not quite as quick, but pretty quick. So that in the first year, and the private rental was much more sluggish, because the sort of people who have the disposable incomes that they can live anywhere, and actually the Olympic Village didn't really. They actually sacked the management team of Get Living London because they were doing so badly. When we started, only a third of the private apartments were let. Now it's more like 2/3. And increasingly, the private apartments have been taken by Chinese people, and also by I think people from the Indian subcontinent. So that demographic has changed.
Did you find that people were moving in that wanted to live? Imagine staying there in 5-10 years' time.
It varied. That's obviously one of the questions we asked in our interview. In terms of we got their housing history and where they'd lived before, and their reasons for moving into East Village. And of course, again, there was a wide range of reasons for that, which again couldn't neatly be correlated with people's kind of class trajectories, if you like. But certainly there was a minority of people, and they tended to be people with young children for obvious reasons, who did see themselves as staying there for a considerable period of time. One of the reasons for moving was that there was a new primary school, there was an academy school, which they obviously saw their children going to, and that kind of overrode their tenure status. So they could be social tenants, or they could be intermediate or shared ownership. But the very fact they had children meant they had some longer term vision. But a lot of the young professionals clearly didn't. I mean, it was a stepping stone in a sort of, I think they used to call them spiralists, and they were going to be moving somewhere else probably in a couple of years. So they didn't have such an immediate stake, such a long-term stake, I should say. Then, in terms of seeing East Village as a didn't see it as a workplace, because obviously most people worked elsewhere if they did work at all. They worked, I say, in Canary Wharf or other parts of London, and the connectedness of Stratford was an important factor in them moving there. The fact that they could easily get to other parts of London. The social tenants, their position was different, because a lot of them had existing social networks in East London. I mean, they had grandparents or uncles and aunts and whatever who lived in other parts of, living in Walthamstow or indeed other parts of Newham. And I think that provided them, and they also had children, and I think that provided them with a sense of, a sense of East Village as part of East London. See? Which is quite different from the point of view of a lot of the private tenants who saw it probably. It offered them a prospect on the city. I mean, a lot of them spend a lot of time saying, well, I really like it because I can sit in the balcony and I can look over to the Olympic Park. I can look over and I can see Canary Wharf. So for some, it was a refuge. It was a place which was safe and was quiet. And although other people objected to that because it was too quiet, too sanitised, but some people liked it, so it was more like a refuge. Other people, it was a prospect. It's a very different view of the world, really. For some, it was a launch pad. This was a stepping stone to something bigger and better. But nevertheless, for the time being, it would do. And there were definite positives. The park was a positive. Some obviously went to used the sporting facilities. They went to the Copper Box and they did sports stuff there. On the whole, the social tenants used the park less. The tenants, on the whole, regarded the North Park as theirs. The South Park was for visitors. The North Park was more their kind of space. And some had. They weren't allowed to have pets, so nobody had dogs or anything. But they would go there. Some people would go there on a quite regular basis. Go to the Timber Lodge Cafe and so forth. But on the whole, the social tenants, their networks were not that. They were, as I say, more dispersed into East London. The young people, interestingly, very rarely went to the Olympic Park. They went to Draper's Field, which has a long history as a recreational space for this part of East London. And after the Olympics, it was turned into quite a nice space with football. There was a football academy that was started from East Village itself, very successful, and involving girls as well as boys. But they would go to Draper's Field. All the kids at Chobham Academy said, well, where do you go? Do you go to the Olympic Park? Oh, no, don't go there. No, we go to Draper's Field. That's where we hang out with our mates. So it was kind of ironic in a way that they built this amazing Olympic Park, but actually a lot of the local, especially the young people to whom it was addressed, the Olympics were addressed, don't really go there.
Just to ask you another question about community involvement. There's been lots of investment in constructing a community, building a community.
Yeah.
Could you comment on that and the difference between formal and informal strategies?
Oh, right, okay, yeah. Well, I think, yes, as I said, they've invested a lot with these community engagement officers. I mean, interesting enough, there is not a community centre. There's the health centre, which is an extraordinary place. I mean, it's like a cathedral to. It eventually will serve, of course, the whole residential population of East 20. So at the moment it's very underused, but it is a very lavishly equipped, unlike any other medical GP surgery I've ever been in. So in principle, part of the health centre is supposed to be a community space. And we actually used it for the video and the photography. But it then became a source of conflict between the LLDC and the the NHS. I'm not sure of all the details, but all I do know is that community space was closed. So that was the only community space that there was at the time. The Chobham Academy School is in principle supposed to open up after school hours and to be used as a community resource. Again, that hasn't happened. They have a wonderful vicar without portfolio. Again, she doesn't have a church, but she's been very active in kind of getting people involved in various kinds of community activities. There is a pub called The Neighbourhood, which is a rather unneighbourly looking place. It's a bit of a barn of a place, really. So it's rather strange, actually, that there isn't actually a community centre. And a lot of people have mentioned this to us, and one of our recommendations is that they should indeed build one. But I think you're right in the sense that what's more important is not the kind of formal community organisations, the Residents Association and the online. The online stuff was very important at the beginning. They set up a Facebook group, and this became a sort of, it was a virtual community. And people would sort of put onto it about their sort of gripes about this and that, and it became an instant forum, and that was the only way they had of communicating. And then they set up the Residents Association and one or two other organisations. But much more important is a much less dramatic way in which people get to know their neighbours. Women get together, they're collecting their kids from school, they start chatting. It's much more informal kind of neighbouring, I suppose. We did a special study of Share East, which I'll finish on. This is an attempt to create a kind of sharing economy. I'd call it a moral economy, really. Where what people do is that they trade in this strange currency called echoes. And what it is, if I know how to fix bikes, and you know how to fix computers. So if your bike needs fixing, I'll come and fix it for you, and I'll earn maybe 2 echoes for that. And then if I need my computer fixing, and you know how to do that, that'll also cost 2 echoes. So that's how it works out. So an attempt to kind of formalise the kind of moral economy of community, the ordinary kind of sharing and chatting and gossiping, that I think is the real work of community, actually. Try and formalise that in some way. The problem with it was that the social tenants didn't feel they had, if you like, the social capital, the skills, the know-how to offer. So whereas the more middle class people, did know or did have this kind of stuff, so that it got taken up by predominantly middle class tenants. Whether there was a private or shared, whatever tenure it was, but there were more middle class sort of professional types who had these particular kinds of expertises that they could trade. The social tenants felt that they couldn't be on equal footing, you see, and also they felt that they would start owing echoes, so they would be using other people's skills and expertise, but they didn't have anything themselves to contribute, so they'd end up owing 20 echoes or 30 echoes or 40 echoes, and what were they going to do, So I think that's a little cautionary tale about trying to, and again, because of this Olympic narrative that was kind of imposed on East Village, it was about bringing people together and getting people to share and be one happy family and so on. That pressure didn't really help, because what needed to happen and what still needs to happen is people to work through their differences, work through these tensions. And this is something that has to happen informally on a day-to-day basis. Maybe it can be helped a little bit by joint activities. We suggested actually that each block should create its own, have a summer arts project, and they should create a kind of totem. People bring together their objects, and it's made up into a sculpture, and brings together the children and the adults and people from the different blocks. There are joint activities that would help to maybe ease some of those tensions around noise. But I think it has to happen slowly and at its own pace. But because of the public spotlight on East Village and the pressures on the management, they felt they had to act quickly and decisively to stifle any kind of overt conflict, and therefore they inhibited and foreclosed the actual working through of those conflicts which whenever you bring together people in a situation like that from different backgrounds and different expectations, different stories, there's bound to be tensions. And that's what community is. Community is a way of working through them. It's not some organic thing, it's a process. And it happens, it's a moment where people come together, there'd be another moment when they're at each other's throats, then there'd be another moment where they come together again.
Just one more question actually about
4 more minutes of battery.
Right.
5 years on.
Yeah. How will it be?
Positive, negative scenarios. What's the best case scenario? How would you like to see the village develop? And what would be your concerns?
Well, as I say, I think it's an ongoing process. My worry is that there'll be a polarisation between those who stay because they're stuck. I mean, they're kind of socially immobilised. They can't. They're not. You know, they can't move. They can't afford to move. They've got no reason to move. And those who are simply sort of onwards and upwards, you know, they're kind of moving on to the next place, the next better job, and so on. So there would be a rapid turnover of those people. So you have a hard core of predominantly social tenants and maybe some shared owners, but who are not perhaps getting on very well. And then a much larger penumbra of people who are kind of moving through and see East Village as a kind of staging point in their lives and in their sort of general sort of development. I think that would be the worst case scenario. Well, the best case scenario, well, one thing we're trying to do is we're trying to establish a group, what we call citizen social scientists, that is people we've met who live on East Village, who we're going to train up as ethnographers to make a continuing year-on record of the estate, in the hope that it'll become a sort of lifetime estate. So we'll have this ongoing story told from within, not by people like me, but by people who actually live there, maybe also using photography and stuff, as a continuing record. And that actually people will develop their own narrative of the place, which won't be the Olympic narrative, won't be beholden to these absurd legacy promises that could never be delivered, won't be, but it'd be a different kind of convergence, a convergence of people's sense of shared space, of place, of belonging, in fact, to a version of the East End that has enough links with the past, right? So it's not simply just relegating the old East End, oh, that's the bad old days, and now we're in this wonderful new international business centre, Westfield shopping centre, the West End comes to the East End, but a new East End which will be genuinely a mixture of the old and the new. I know it sounds a bit romantic and utopian, but that would be my best hope.